really grateful and happy to introduce Sarah Atayero. So Sarah's a trainee clinical psychologist who works with both adults and young people with a range of mental health disorders, including depression and anxiety. Prior to this, Sarah read for a degree in experimental psychology at the University of Oxford and later completed an MSc in affective disorders at King's College. What an education, man. Wow. Sarah's experience of working within NHS mental health services highlighted multiple challenges intersecting with her identity as a Black woman. Consequently, Sarah campaigned, researched and wrote extensively on the experiences of Black British individuals in the UK mental health system, both as service users and practitioners, with features in The Psychologist magazine and recent anthology, The Colour of Madness. Sarah's work with the BIPP network is grounded in building a community of support, both physically and online, in a field that can be challenging for BME mental health practitioners. This is demonstrated through events she's facilitated, such as managing anxiety and finding strength in the community, series for doctoral clinical psychology applicants, and the racial trauma and well-being event in response to George Floyd's death and the raising racial tensions across the world. Sarah hopes to continue connecting BME mental health professionals from all over the UK and beyond, whilst part of an organisation such as BIPP that provides the space and education on decolonisation in psychology and models in Black African-centred therapies, essential teaching that was excluded from her own psychological training. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you. I didn't realise how long that bio was, but thank you for bearing with me. Thank you everyone who is here. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your Friday afternoons to listen to me speak. I'm going to try and now share my presentation. I've got a couple of slides, but I know that it can be difficult. What am I sharing? Okay, so it says a window. I'm clicking on a window. I'm clicking PowerPoint, play from start. Can everyone see that okay? Yes?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay. Thank you everyone for showing up today to my talk on decolonising psychology from beyond the academy. I was going to do a little intro, but Jermaine has already done a wonderful one. Mine was very brief, as you can see. But basically a little bit about me and also the BIP network, which Jermaine has already kind of talked about a bit of the work that I've done there. But I did want to kind of flag up a talk that we have next week, which is called In Conversation with Black Professors in Mental Health. So we have the wonderful Professor Stephanie Hatch speaking, who is a great mentor of mine, and we also have Professor Dawn Edge speaking, and I think it'll be a really fantastic event. Tickets went live today and they are also free. So if anyone is interested in hearing more about that, then definitely do grab yourself a ticket. Okay, so the agenda for today looks like a lot. I hope it's not a lot. I'm not planning to talk for that long, but I want to start off by talking about kind of what the issues are in terms of mental health care inequality, and then go on to have a bit of a conversation around what we mean by decolonisation, the different definitions, and how that kind of sits with diversity and inclusion. And then I guess the focal point of my talk today is thinking about why we need decolonisation out of academia. So why is it important to be thinking about decolonisation in clinical practice and more applied settings? And then just thinking about what that actually looks like, and we'll be taking you through kind of my own experience. Main focal point is why we need decolonisation in practice. And I've put a few of the things that I'm going to be talking about, but there will be other things there. And then the last point will be what you can do in terms of kind of adding to the anti-racist practice and decolonisation in practice that we'll be talking about. Okay, so what is the issue? Thinking about mental health care inequality. Now, whenever I do talks to do with mental health care inequality, I always bring up kind of two key statistics that I think really highlight the mental health care inequality that we have. First being that after controlling for differences in levels of common mental health disorder symptoms, white British middle-aged 35 to 45 years old women were most likely to receive treatment for common mental health disorders. Now that came from the Adult Psychiatric Morbidity Survey, which was a national survey of adults in the UK, where they kind of asked them about experiences of mental health, issues accessing treatment, how much treatment they'd had in the past. And if we think about the services that are available, we think about services like IAPT, so that's improving access to psychological therapies. And that was an initiative set up by the government in 2008, kind of rolled out nationally. And the idea was that we wanted to make talking therapies more accessible to the general population and reduce waiting times. And so we're thinking about this specific population would be the population that were more likely to access that type of service. And then we think about the counter of that, which is the fact that Black African and Black Caribbean ethnic groups are more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act compared to other ethnic groups. And this came from the Care Quality Commission, who conducted a project called Count Me In Consensus, and that was in, I think the last one was in 2010, where they were actively trying to reduce the disproportionate number of people from Black backgrounds who are being detained under the Mental Health Act. Now, just thinking about these two statistics and holding them in mind, if we think about the first one, like I said, it represents issues of common mental health disorders, so things like anxiety and depression, which are quite prevalent in the population. And then we think the second one is more severe, enduring mental health issues, where someone's got to the state where their mental health is so severe and complex that they have to be detained by law and kind of treated sometimes against their will in order to make them better. And just thinking about two populations that are accessing those services and why it is mental health care has got this way. And just thinking about some of the research out there, if we look at the kind of quality of treatment and kind of the routes that Black people have into mental health care, it's usually via the police under Section 136 of the Mental Health Act. And like I said, also more likely to be detained under the Mental Health Act. And if we think about when Black people maybe do try to access treatment at earlier stages or maybe at different services, statistics have shown that the quality of treatment is poorer, and that they're less likely to achieve recovery, and also less likely to kind of receive the type of therapy that they wanted. So just thinking about the kind of inequality of access and quality of treatment that Black people have. So yeah, hopefully that set up the scope and the landscape of mental health care at the moment and the inequalities that exist. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it because, like I said, I really want to talk about kind of how to solve this problem and decolonisation in practice. But I just wanted to kind of highlight this quote from a fantastic paper by Keating and Robertson, 2004. It's titled "Fear, Black People and Mental Illness, a Vicious Circle." And the paper really talks about kind of the perceptions and misconceptions that there are about Black people and the biases that are held, and why that leads to poor quality of care and maybe overuse of medication and sectioning and things like that. And this quote here, it says, mental health services are acting as a form of social control, especially when they are marshaled by the police, social workers, psychiatrists, and family members. And just thinking about what that means in context and how, I guess, this really resonates with the current climate that we're in. The history that Black people have had with psychiatric care and the police, and how actually the environment and kind of the idea of mental health might not be seen as more welcoming. And actually, I think from my own experience and in clinical practice, what I found is that Black people and people from BAME communities are categorized as hard to reach groups. So thinking about the IAPT services that I mentioned earlier, IAPT was launched in 2008, and then in 2011, David Clark, who is a researcher at Oxford, released a kind of summary report of the initial stages of IAPT. And what they found was that there were certain populations who weren't accessing psychological therapies via this route. And it was older adults, and it was also people from BAME backgrounds. And they've been kind of categorized as hard to reach ever since. And that's the kind of terminology that we use to describe BAME people who want to access mental health treatments, is that they're hard to reach. And I really feel like that is not the right language we should be using. And I think we should really challenge this. Don't feel that we should be putting the onus on BAME people. They're often described as they've got stigma in the community, or maybe lack psychoeducation about mental health, and that's why they're not accessing services. We need to be thinking about why services aren't kind of feeling like they're accessible to these groups and thinking about actually the onus should be on services to change what they're doing in order to be more accommodating and, yeah, more culturally appropriate, I guess. So just really challenging this idea that people from BAME backgrounds are hard to reach group when it comes to mental health care, and thinking about the context that this has all kind of existed in. Okay, and then thinking about representation in psychology, this is something I guess is specific to my field, which is clinical psychology, but is really replicated across psychology and psychiatry. These two stats here talks about kind of the lack of individuals or trainees from BAME backgrounds. So these statistics, I think the top one is not the most recent one, but I guess the proportions haven't changed since 2016. Which is the fact that of the people that apply to go on to clinical training, so to train as a clinical psychologist and treat people with mental health issues, only 4% are Asian and only 2% are Black. And that really is reflected in my current cohort. I'm one of 40 trainees, and I'm the only Black woman on the course, only Black person on the course. And if we think about why that might be, again, we have this kind of onus is placed on the applicant. So the idea that people from BME backgrounds lack the reflective skills and kind of competencies that are needed to gain entry onto these courses. And again, I think that's unfair, and we should be actually questioning the recruitment process and the application process more. So think about some of the entry requirements that are needed. You need to have a first at undergraduate, or if not, you need to get distinction at master's level. A lot of individuals from BAME backgrounds fail to achieve a first due to issues that they face at undergraduate, and that's a very common fact, and we've got loads of evidence and support of that. So again, that's already a barrier to accessing this career. And then you think about kind of pre-qualification jobs and how little of them there are, and how there are a lot of them that require you to work voluntary, which again is not something that a lot of people can do if you aren't from a privileged background. And then just thinking about my experience, I don't consider myself an academic, so I always like to think about my own kind of anecdotal experience that kind of speaks to what I'm speaking about. And just thinking about some of the things I've had. So are you the student nurse? I started my clinical psychology training only a couple of weeks ago. And on my pre-placement visit, I was, introduced to all of the team, and I was introduced to a member of staff. Said, yeah, I'm the new trainee here. I'm going to be starting placement for a year. And there's actually a Black member of staff. And she said, oh, are you the new student nurse? And I think that says a lot. One small question can pack such a lot of information, in the sense that there are certain roles that people from Black backgrounds are positioned within the NHS, and that's usually one of nursing. And obviously, if we think about the history behind that, we think about Windrush and how Black Caribbean women were kind of brought in to save the NHS, in a sense. There's still this idea that there's only certain positions that Black people can hold within the mental health services. And this one is one I hadn't really thought about until, again, I started training. So the idea that we're encouraged to talk about our own identities within kind of the academic context and clinical training and clinical practice, but then actually there's such poor representation that, when you submit an assignment, it's supposed to be marked anonymously, and they're not supposed to know who the person writing the assignment is. But I went to a talk on diversity, and it was run by my course, and they had a trainee who was a Black woman who had graduated maybe 3 years ago. So this is, you're thinking the degree's 3 years long, and she's graduated 3 years ago. So this is 6 years ago. She was at Royal Holloway. She was talking about the difficulties that she found writing assignments that had to be reflective, and talking about the relationship that she had with clients when they were encouraged to talk about their identity. And she said, if I write down how, being a Black therapist intersected with being a woman and the client and whatever, the course leaders would know it was me, because I'm the only Black woman in this course. And she was running a session joint with one of the course members, and the course members said quite flippantly, she said, oh, and those are things that we're trying to change. And thankfully, because diversity is improving on the course, those things aren't an issue anymore. And I just kind of sat there on this Zoom call looking at my cohort, who is all white and Asian, and I'm the only Black woman. And I thought, well, that issue is going to face me, and I'm going to have the exact same issue. And in 6 years of the course running, nothing has changed. So that was something I hadn't really thought about until recently. And then again, there's this notion that you kind of need to keep your head down and qualify. And so kind of individuals from BAME backgrounds who are on training courses or working within mental health basically, are fitting them to having to kind of shrink themselves to fit into a system that is not necessarily kind of tolerant or welcoming of all the cultural experience and the value that they can bring. And what ends up happening is that we have a kind of de-skilling of staff who come from BAME communities. They're not bringing their whole selves, which could actually really contribute to some of the issues that the NHS is facing in terms of not being able to access BAME groups and treat them adequately and to a standard that we would consider great for the NHS. So those are just a few things from my own experience. But to back that up with some of the research evidence, so the Snow White Peaks report by Roger Klein in 2014 is a really fantastic paper that I would encourage anyone who works in the NHS or is interested in the NHS to read. And the reason it's called Snow White Peaks is the idea that if we think about the hierarchy in the NHS and who are the kind of consultants and managers and service leads tend to all be individuals from white backgrounds. And then the lower down in the hierarchy, if we think about kind of support staff, administrators, clinical clerks, cleaners or support workers, kind of lower banding staff members tend to be from BAME communities. And the stats that I have on the screen here talk about kind of how even in London, one of the most ethnically diverse cities that we have in the UK, 40% of the London NHS mental health trusts had no BAME members on their kind of boards at all. And then the second point here I think is really important, the idea that there actually has been an established link between the treatment of BME staff and how we're treated and how we feel at work actually links to the care that patients receive. And one thing I wanted to talk about, the report also speaks a lot about kind of how Black members of staff are treated in terms of Black members of staff or BAME members of staff are more likely to face disciplinary procedures within the workplace. They're less likely to be promoted or receive mentoring, all these little things that kind of create, I guess, a hostile work culture and work environment. And that's definitely stuff I could speak to if I wanted to really dwell on the issues and the inequalities. But hopefully I'm setting up the scene and you're understanding why we need decolonisation within clinical practice well. And then just a few snippets here from a paper that speaks to specifically individuals from BAME backgrounds, experience of clinical psychology training. Even if I didn't tell you that, I would say that this is kind of experiences that anyone who works in the NHS who's from a BAME background can attest to. Or anyone who's training within mental health can also speak to. Okay, hopefully you've had time to read that. I'm going to move on. I want to get to the main chunk of the session. So really thinking about what is decolonisation. And hopefully this works. I can't see how many people are in the call, and I don't know if you're on computers or on your phones, but would like to try and do a little bit of an interactive activity. I'm going to have to come out of this screen, but I want you guys to kind of submit responses in terms of what you think decolonisation means, what do we mean when we say decolonisation, and hopefully we can kind of see some of the responses that come through. You can either scan the QR code on the left using your phone, or you can go to menti.com and enter the code 6082175. Do shout out if you have any issues with doing this. Yeah?
Sarah, because of the interruption last time, is stop sharing your slides again, so we can't.
I can't tell because I'm presenting in the dark here, but I'm going to reshare my presentation.
That'd be great.
Can you see it? Let me know when you can see this.
Yep, I can see.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Did everyone hear my instructions? Hopefully you understand to either scan the QR code or go to menti.com, enter the code and write a response for what you think decolonisation means or what you think of when you hear the word decolonisation. And I will give you all a couple of minutes to do that. And I will switch to sharing Menti so that you can see what some of the responses that have been submitted are. So bear with me, present a window, this one, share. Okay, so can we all see the kind of window that's popped up? Okay. Yes? No?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant. Fantastic. Right. So we have justice has come up, challenging narratives, particularly historical. That's a great one. Restorative justice, to bring in other perspectives is valid and valued, decentering whiteness and Western knowledge. That's a great one. I think it's about trying to, full scroll. Okay, that one's gone. I'm going to have to try and find it back. But recognizing the impact that colonialism has had on whatever we are looking to decolonize, and trying to address this to ensure equal opportunities, moving away from Eurocentric narratives, giving equal considerations to views from different parts of the world / cultures. See if I can find the one that was lost. Oh, okay. I can't find the last one. I'm so sorry to that person who submitted that, but it looked like a great definition for my initial screening of it. But yeah, already we can see that there's a theme coming up. I think a main theme for me is the idea of challenging what the kind of status quo in the current environment that we're in. The idea of challenging Western knowledge, decentering whiteness, and moving away from this kind of Eurocentric way of being. I think those are great definitions. I'm going to come out of this screen and try and reshare my presentation. This is not smooth presenting from me, but you're just going to have to bear with me. Okay, so back to PowerPoint. Where is PowerPoint? Okay, there. Back to PowerPoint. Thank you so much for everyone who participated. I was scared that no one might do that. And there is another Menti coming up, so if you didn't get the chance to do that one, then there will be another one later on. So different definitions from the interweb. First of all, if you're like me, when you first heard the term decolonisation, you kind of knew what it meant, but you didn't really know what it meant. So you went to Google and Googled it. And so the first definition that would have come up was a very literal one from Wikipedia. So the action or process of a state withdrawing from a former colony and leaving it independent. And thankfully, no one wrote that, because I guess this definition really is incongruous to how we currently use the term decolonisation. This is a really literal one. The second one, which I quite like, is the freeing of minds from colonial ideology, in particular by addressing the ingrained idea that to be colonised was to be inferior. And I kind of like this one because it's speaking closer to the experience of BAME individuals. And then the last one, which comes from Decolonising SOAS, which was set up in response to the Decolonise the Curriculum student movement. That was in around 2013, 2016, between those years. I can't remember specifically, but describes decolonisation as the effort to integrate and transform the institutional structure and epistemological legacies of colonialism. I really like this one because of the idea of transformation of the institution, and I think that's really what we're working on when we talk about decolonisation, both within academia and outside of academia. Now, I want to think about decolonisation in kind of congruence with diversity and inclusion, or incongruence. I think these words are often used interchangeably. I think decolonisation less so, because that's more of a radical word, and people who actually know what it means use it more. And I think people who want to kind of soften the word decolonisation tend to use diversity and inclusion. And when I say people, I actually mean institutions. I don't think there are any institutions that have decolonisation working groups, and we tend to have diversity and inclusion working groups. But just thinking about, what does diversity mean? We've got this definition here. It talks about diversity encompasses acceptance and respect for the full range of human experience characteristics in their social, ecological, historical, and cultural contexts, as well as understanding that each individual, family, community, and societal group has uniqueness that makes them different from others. And when I think about this, what really pops into mind is the Equality Act and how we have protected characteristics under the Equality Act. And it's about kind of accepting that people are different. So in a sense, diversity, when we think about diversity in institutions, it's really, and how I think about diversity in institutions is really that you want me as a Black person and someone who looks visibly different, but you don't necessarily want me, my culture, my thoughts. You just kind of want an array of diverse faces. And then thinking about inclusion. So inclusion is an organizational effort and practices in which different groups or individuals having different backgrounds are culturally and socially accepted, welcomed, and equally treated. So a little bit better than diversity isn't just talking about visual representation now or representation of difference, but actual inclusion in these systems that exist. But again, to me, inclusion isn't quite there yet. You're now saying that you're happy to have me in your institute and you're happy to make me feel kind of more welcomed and accepted. But the institution itself is not necessarily one that was built to accept someone like me. So if we think about, like I said, the history of kind of Black people and mental health organisations and institutions and the use of the Mental Health Act and police brutality and all of that. So it's not necessarily that we're wanting to integrate into the services that we currently have, but actually challenge them and challenge the ideas that they were built on. And so just thinking about why we want to challenge and why we want to kind of change the current systems that we have within kind of academia and also particularly from my perspective, clinical practice. And I started off by talking about the racist and colonial history of scientific inquiry. And I just want to think about how we view science and what science really is. We often think of it as something that's objective and kind of free from bias and things like that, but actually we've got to think about scientific inquiry and how it is born out of the social context that the inquiry was made in. So if we think about the questions that researchers are asking at the moment, if we think about the current climate, we've got COVID-19, a lot of the research questions and papers that are coming out at the moment are to do with kind of public response to kind of crisis and how to encourage behavioural change at times of uncertainty and things like that. So scientific inquiry is born out of the social context it's in. And if we think about the fact that Britain has had a colonial history, had a kind of a very violent past and a very racist past, a lot of the inquiry around that time also had those ideologies in mind. And to give an example, thinking about intelligence tests and IQ testing now. This is a fantastic book written in 2004 called Even the Rat Was White, and it's a fantastic historical overview of psychology and taught me a lot in my undergraduate days. But just to think about kind of standardized testing, psychometric testing, if you think of things like the WISC and the WACE, you can see here it talks about how early psychologists involved in psychometric testing and the study of intelligence, such as Spearman, Pearson and Thorndike, were all actual prominent members of eugenicist groups like the Eugenics Education Society. So kind of just overt racism in that sense, or scientific racism. And actually, Wexler stated that due to their omission in normalization of the sample, the test, so the WACE in this example, could not be used on the coloured population of the United States for the measurement of intelligence. And yet we have the WACE, which is kind of thought of a gold standard of IQ testing that has been applied to all populations across the West and non-Western countries, and how actually we're using a measure that was designed to validate the inferiority of Black people, to assess them for kind of educational services, mental health services, and not really questioning where this gold standard of testing came from. So that's just one example of kind of the racist history of academia. But other reasons why I'm calling for kind of decolonisation outside of academia is that it takes too long from theory to practice and we're running out of time. So research shows that it takes on average 17 years for research evidence to be translated into clinical practice. I think if we're thinking about kind of culturally adaptive therapies or best ways of practice for clients from BAME groups, if it goes through the academic process, then we're going to be waiting a long time. And the reason I say we're running out of time is, I think, unless you've been living under a rock, you've seen the current climate we're in terms of how Black people have been treated and the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd's death. This isn't an issue of, oh, we're just trying to make things a little bit better. The poor access to treatment, poor quality of treatment is costing Black people their lives in some instances. We think about the overrepresentation of individuals from BAME backgrounds in the deaths from COVID-19. And so actually we need to be doing a lot better, a lot faster. And so I'm just kind of challenging that actually maybe going through the academic route isn't always the best in the case of mental health care or just healthcare inequalities in general. And thirdly, actually, is my third point, but debate is not a response to racism. So again, thinking about everything that happened earlier this year, and there was this outpouring of reading lists and Black authors to read, and reading Frantz Fanon and Audre Lorde and everything, all the people that you're supposed to read to be woke or a good ally. And there was 1 minute silences, there were statements written by organizations who later then kind of just went back to doing the things that they were doing. And this quote that debate is not a response to racism comes from Deanne Bell, who is a senior lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. And she said this during a BIP event that she kind of hosted earlier this year, and just really emphasizing the idea that we need transformative work. It's no longer the time for 1 minute silences and statements, but actually we need to be doing the actual work, and this can come directly from clinical practice. Okay, so thinking about what this looks like in clinical practice, what do we mean when we say decolonisation or decolonising clinical practice? So there's a lot. I realised I had talking points on all these points, but I'm just going to freestyle. But first of all is increasing representation from BME backgrounds among mental health professionals. Now, it might seem a bit contradictory to what I said earlier, in the sense that we need more than just diversity, and I think that statement still rings true. But the reason that representation from BME backgrounds from mental health professionals is so important is that, like I said, they bring with them the cultural knowledge, the understanding of what it's like to exist in a kind of Western and quite hostile environment as a BAME individual in the UK. And it's not necessarily, I don't believe in racial matching for therapy. It's not that we need Black therapists to treat Black patients. Yes, sometimes that's the case, and Black patients should have that choice, but at the moment they don't. And you often kind of hear the reverse, which is you've got, white racist patients saying that they don't want to be seen by an Asian doctor or a Black therapist, and they have the choice to have someone to be seen by someone from their own race. Now, I'm not saying that's good practice, but actually the state that the mental health system stands at the moment, people from BAME backgrounds wouldn't necessarily have that option. And how do we increase representation? Well, schemes like mentoring schemes, we think about representation on interview panels. So actually that was one of the suggestions that came out of the Snow White Peaks report, the idea that we need BAME representation on interview panels for higher bands. And actually that report had a lot of fantastic recommendations, but also a lot of evidence in support of how these schemes and mentoring schemes and monitoring of diversity and interview panel stuff was all put into place, but very quickly disbanded, underfunded, and we went back to kind of square one, and there wasn't that kind of accountability to continue that work. So there's a lot to be done in increasing representation, but just thinking about some of the barriers that I mentioned earlier in terms of some of the entry requirements into professional training courses. So thinking more about contextual offers as opposed to blanket kind of specifications and requirements that you need to meet in order to be suited for a course. And the second one, so breaking away from Western conceptualizations of distress. Now this one is really crucial. And I think in clinical practice, when we think about therapy and the way it's taught, if you think about things like CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, it's always thought of as like apolitical, and it doesn't really kind of take culture into context, but it can be applied to anyone. But actually thinking about how culture is important to some people, or even just breaking away from a medicalized model of distress and really hearing people when they describe their explanatory map for their illness. And this is something that we're taught, but then I think isn't applied to all types of illnesses. So to give a specific example, we're taught in psychology and clinical practice that you should use the words that the client uses to describe their experience. So if someone is suffering from panic attacks and they call the panic attack an event, you would say, okay, what happened when you had that event? You wouldn't say what happened when you had a panic attack. So we're always taught to use the language and the conceptualization that the client uses. But then I was actually in a training yesterday on CBT for psychosis, and they were talking about recovery work. and how actually there doesn't need to be congruence between the clinician's understanding of the individual psychosis and where it came from, and the client's understanding of where the psychosis came from. And the woman said, you know, you don't need congruence, you don't need to agree if they think it's spiritual or something like that. You don't need to collude with their kind of delusions. And I just thought, that is so wrong. And this idea that mental health or mental ill health in terms of psychosis is due to kind of dysregulation of dopamine or physical changes and things like that, and not accepting non-Western views of maybe there's a spiritual cause, or maybe I did something in a past life and this is my punishment. Not necessarily saying that these are the explanations for mental health, but just saying that clinicians shouldn't be kind of invalidating those experiences or those explanatory maps, and really breaking away from that Western conceptualization of distress. Redefining difference. So blackness is a positive, and there's a load of papers that are included in the references for this presentation. But when we think about when there's research actually done on Black people or individuals from BAME background, it's often not in a positive light. Like I said, it's usually the idea that the stigma amongst the community, they're not accessing treatment, they're waiting too long to ask for help, or they're somaticizing their symptoms. They're not, you know, that they're not kind of psychologically literate, and they're not able to kind of think psychologically or be psychologically minded. And if we think about kind of maybe in inpatient settings or more complex and enduring mental health settings, there's all this evidence and support of kind of bias against individuals or service users from Black backgrounds. They're seen as more aggressive, and that leads to negative things like overuse of force or overuse of psychotic medication and medication to kind of subdue people. So really kind of thinking about when we are talking about Black people or people from BAME backgrounds in psychology, and we are practicing, how are we treating them, or how are we viewing them? Are they agents? Do they have agency? Can they think psychologically minded, or is there such a, I guess, what's the best way to say it? Is there such discrepancy in the way that we communicate that we're not really getting to see the positives and all the positives that this community and population bring? Now, avoiding euphemistic speech. Again, this is stolen from Deanne Bell from Nottingham-Trent. And she spoke about how we need to stop not calling racism racism. And we use other words like attainment gap or processing biases, or kind of, yeah, just not calling racism racism, and how that kind of strips Black and brown people from the ability to kind of voice their concerns and voice the issues that they're having. We're calling it microaggressions, or actually microaggressions when they're daily and chronic and perpetuating can build up to be so much more than micro. So just calling racism where it is. And there's a couple of papers again that I've included in the reference that talk about how if staff aren't talking about racism amongst themselves, how are we expecting as therapists our clients to feel comfortable talking about racism and bringing that into the therapy room? So this is work that needs to be done amongst mental health professionals, people teaching mental health and training mental health, but really just calling it what it is. And there's a lot of emotions that comes with that. Often there's white guilt and pain and trauma. If we think, I know a lot of therapists from BAME backgrounds, when all the Black Lives Matter stuff was happening, there was a kind of anger that there was this sudden awakening to something that they've been experiencing their whole lives and historically and were very aware of. So yes, it's going to be a painful process, but actually there's a lot of healing to be found from calling it what it is. And then I've put reducing stigma within BAME communities last and crossed out, because I truly believe that if everything I mentioned above was consciously implemented, that there wouldn't be a need to kind of challenge stigma of mental health illness among BME communities. There wouldn't be a fear of services or a perspective that mental health services are only for the rich, white, or worried well, and that it would be hard to find a clinician who understands your experience of racial discrimination and the impacts on your mental health, or that you wouldn't be able to communicate due to language barriers and other barriers that we often say are barriers for individuals from BAME communities accessing mental health care. Okay, so moving on to what can you do, and I have a sense that there's another Menti coming up. I was correct. So if you're happy to jump back onto Menti, I think I have to move it along myself as a presenter. So it might not be there. It might still be on what does decolonisation look like. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so I'm gonna go back to the screen. Can everyone see the PowerPoint presentation on the screen? Use the code and just enter kind of your understanding or some of the things that you view as good allyship, or what you should be doing as an ally, or if you're not an ally, what you feel like allies should be doing. And yeah, I'm just interested to hear kind of your thoughts and perspectives on what that looks like.
Hi, Sarah. Really sorry. We can't see the screen anymore. It looks like the slides got kicked out. So if you could pop them back up and present one more time. Thank you.
Presenting the, what do I want to present? Okay, I want to present my PowerPoint presentation so you can see the QR code and the code. Can everyone see that? Yes. I need verbal feedback. I can't see anything. Okay, good. Thank you. All right. So yeah, please enter your ideas about allyship on the Menti. And I'm going to give it kind of 60 more seconds, and then we can go over to Menti and see all the wonderful ideas that you are sharing. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and jump over to Menti and see what we have so far. Okay, this is actually working. Okay, a Chrome tab. No, cancel. Present now, a window, and Menti share. All right, we can all see some of the ideas that are coming through. So the idea of taking initiative, I like that. Promoting the work of others, being proactive, not reactive, that's really good. Conscious empathy, recognition of ideas, using your platform, that's a really great one. Owning mistakes, accountability, public support, being open, advocacy, doing your own education, I like that one, listening. So really great ideas, and I think what the theme that I'm getting from this kind of word cloud is the idea of being proactive and not really kind of waiting for individuals from BAME backgrounds or marginalized groups to tell you what to do, but really kind of taking steps to challenge the current structures that we have in place. So yay, thank you everyone for doing that. I was really scared no one would do it. Okay, so back to the presentation, present now, window. PowerPoint is not coming up, of course, because that would be too easy to transition smoothly back to PowerPoint. Okay, so, okay, brilliant. And current slide. Thank you everyone for doing that. And just, I'm going to share a really brilliant infographic from Dr. Muna Abdi, who's fantastic, and you should all follow her on Twitter. But some of the ideas that she talks about here is owning your own privilege, so recognizing the power, privilege and resources you have, and think about how you can use that to support the work of others, people who are othered, and someone mentioned that in the word cloud. I've already talking about the uncomfortable, being strategic in your activism. Being an ally is more than just joining protests and marches, but using your institutional power to change structures and systems. Figuring out where and how you can do the most, I think, is really good. Someone mentioned earlier not just reacting, and just really thinking about your allyship and what you can do. Other bits, thinking about what do you want the future to look like? I think this is a fantastic question. Resisting the white savior complex, starting within your own circle, and being brave. So yeah, those are really fantastic ones. But just to round off and thinking about when we are doing this work, what does it look like, and what are some of the things that can come up? I talked earlier about how this paper by Keating and Robinson is really, really good one. It talks about basically when they did try to change the system and also try to bring in anti-racist practice into training and mental health services, thinking about how silence makes it difficult to challenge stereotypes and some of the myths about Black people. And like I said, if it's not safe for professionals to talk about issues of race and culture amongst themselves, then it must be even more difficult for service users, families and carers to talk to professionals about it. And I wanted to end with this. Now, this was the paper with the researchers at UEL who implemented anti-racist practice and workshops into their training course. And they talked about how an important lesson for us as a staff team was the need to take risks, to get it wrong, to say the unspeakable, to find words to name the guilt, the pain, the hurt, and the rage that exclusion and institutionalized racism engenders, and to be kind in supporting each other to do their own work, including examining whiteness. And that's a really fantastic paper that I would encourage anyone who wants to kind of implement decolonisation into their practice to read. So in summary, mental health care inequality exists, and hopefully I've shown that through some of the information that I shared with you. There's an urgent need for decolonisation in clinical practice as opposed to simply diversity and inclusion. Talking about racism and naming it is a powerful way to ensure that Black clients and Black staff do not internalise these experiences. And good allyship includes owning your privilege, talking about the uncomfortable, do your research and start within your own circle. And I think that is everything. A couple of references, happy for the slides to be shared afterwards, but just to say a big thank you for having me. Okay, should I stop sharing? I'm going to stop sharing. I can't hear or see anything. This is really scary. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and come back to the group where I can see people and everyone. We have approximately 9 minutes left. If anyone has questions, please just feel free to speak. I think there's a chat function. If there are any messages in there, I will also answer them via the chat function. If not, thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your Fridays. But hopefully there's at least one question.
Sarah, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I know you're quite early in your training as a clinical psychologist.
Yes.
Have you come up against any resistance to these ideas in your clinical training so far? And
okay.
If so, how do you plan to tackle these?
Okay. Yes, resistance and how to tackle it. I think, I don't want to say unfortunately, but because of the current climate that we're in, I don't think anyone would be so open to resist the idea of diversifying training or decolonisation. And actually, if anything, they were saying it from day one. So especially because I'm training at a London course, I think they're all very aware of the diversity issue that they have. But I still don't think that's enough. So if we think about the current intake of clinical psychologists, as part of my BIP work, I ran a campaign. And so I know actually the numbers in terms of Black trainees for the current cohort. And there are 4 London courses. You've got Royal Holloway, UCL, UEL, and what's the 4th one? King's. From my knowledge, there's only one at Royal Holloway, that's me. There are 5 Black trainees at UEL, maybe 2 at UCL and 1 at King's. So again, that's a huge, I mean, these courses are 30, 40 people big, and despite the kind of admissions process happening in the context of kind of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter movement, we still have that lack of representation. So there is more that needs to be done. There are diversity groups work popping up everywhere, but I think the issue with that is that the diversity groups conflate issues. And so we're not really talking about racism when we're talking about diversity. We're talking about gender equality. We're talking about intersectionality. And yes, all these things are important, but it's really important not to conflate the two. And so I think the work that I'm doing is via BIP. and making sure that we're really keeping anti-racist practice on the agenda, and trying to not necessarily build a collaborative relationship, but I do think there's work to be done in systems and organizations funding the nonprofits and the grassroots projects who are already doing the work. So instead of saying, you know, come do a talk for us, is actually fund us to do the research and the work that we know will actually make substantial change based on our experiences. So I hope that answered your question. I think I went off.
Yeah, I think my question was kind of poorly worded in the sense that I was thinking about psychiatry and clinical practice is quite an old institutional system in a way. And I know that those big systems are very kind of resistant to change. So yeah, I think you kind of answered it in terms of like the need for funding and the groups that you've organised in that sense. So thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you, Scott.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi,
my name's Dawn. Thank you so much for a great talk. And I also can't recommend Stephanie Hatch enough. So if you guys can find out, it's amazing. I suppose this is a really half-baked thought, but I wondered if you might not wander with me on it. There's a lot of talk right now around defunding the police in the US, which I think is badged badly, but ultimately means let's try to remove the active harm that's being done in Black and global majority communities, and also let's get in a stronger kind of social work, mental health support presence. So almost removing a negative factor and adding a positive factor at the same time. And to me, that seems like an incredibly powerful leverage point that could really help with the flow of change in clinical practice in that space. So, you know, obviously I work in the academy, and I believe that even though it is a slow ship to turn, it is still worth doing because we ultimately train and help forge thoughts. But in terms of getting that faster change into clinical practice, I'm wondering if there, just in general, what your thoughts are around that, what you think that might result in your world, and what the effects might be.
I love that you use the term global majority. It's a term that I completely back, and I love, and I hate the use of the term BAME, but that's the term that people know, so I have to use it. But yeah, I completely agree. When we think about mental health issues, particularly the overrepresentation of BAME individuals and communities in these services, a lot of it is social issues. A lot of it is kind of welfare, housing, the physical environment that they're in, and how it's contributing to their mental ill health. And so I absolutely agree that there's more funding. In terms of defunding the police, I mean, I'm all for it, but I understand why there's such a resistance. I mean, the protection that the police have for the privileged and the power that provides, who would want to lose that, you know? Someone who you don't like the look of is walking outside your house into their house. You can just call someone and, you know, they're done for. So, you know, that power that the police have, and the relationship that the police have with Black and brown communities is evidently not a good one. And for the people who don't want decolonisation and don't want equality, I understand why there's such a resistance.
And how fear is such a powerful leverage in preventing that, because I think it's badly branded, like in the way that it's been put forward as defunding the police. Like, police almost never stop actual crime, you know, like they come after the fact and file a report. It's a totally different thing than what we imagine it is, but it's been crafted as this very paternal safety network community by those that benefit and those in power. And I'm just very interested to see where it goes, because I think it could really help in terms of getting these conversations more appropriately in clinical practice. But y'all have to be ready. You have to be ready to have those conversations. And so it's maybe destable, but really exciting.
And I think also there's the fear of kind of, when you hear defund the police, people think, okay, then what will protect us? And, you know, where will all the crime and the terrible things that we have happen? How will we solve that? And I think it's not just asking for things and structures to be removed, but coming with the ideas for change and showing that you know what will work and what's the safe alternative. Thank you, Dawn.
Mind if I jump in and ask a question before our minute and a half is over? You hear so frequently that organizations are doing stuff to address diversity, right? And I think there are some trusts in London that kind of genuinely seem to be trying to get more representation at the top table. how do they and how do we as an organization, because we are just as bad as everybody else, ensure that it's more than just like, let's get a black person in to tick a box and then ignore everything that they say?
I love that question. So I'm thinking about a trust. It's actually a physical health trust of the Whittington NHS Health Trust have actually, I feel like, are at the forefront in that change. And I read about the working group that they set up way before kind of Black Lives Matter happened, and the kind of change that they're advocating for there. And a part of that is about the recruitment process. So having representation on panels is so important. You know, I heard when people were talking about clinical training and the biases that happen, you know, an interviewer once said, oh, you know, that applicant reminded me of my granddaughter. You know, if that applicant is from a BAME background, it's highly likely that the recruitment panel is going to view them as, you know, a family member or friend and see them in that positive light. So for me, recruitment panels and diversity there is so important. It's the same way we have service users and clients on interview panels, because we recognize the importance of having that client voice. So work like that is important. I mentioned earlier about contextual offers. So thinking about the recruitment process and training, and really understanding that we know that there are these disadvantages, these structural barriers for people accessing these careers and these training programs. So why not remove them? And why not make contextual offers? It's not helping out, it's not a handout, it's recognizing that the system we work in is broken. So we need to do active things to change it. And so, yeah, hopefully those are some examples of things that can be done. But then also, like I said, using the work of those grassroots projects who are doing the work and know kind of what works for their community is really, really important.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that reflects a lot of kind of postgraduate clinical and otherwise education as well. There's just a lack of, I hate the word diversity, but there is a lack of it within postgrad stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, Jermaine. Can't hear you if you're saying anything.
Sorry, I was just saying we're at past 6 o'clock. So I just want to say, Sarah, thank you for your time. Alex, thank you for organising. Scott, thank you for organising. And if you don't mind, we'll share those slides around to people.
Yes,
and then
to you.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you very much.
Have a good weekend, everyone.